Very good. All right. Then we will head into this morning's message. I titled the message this morning, The Significance of Fellowship with God. I struggled with that title a little bit because I wanted it to be shorter, but I wanted it to say that, and so eventually I just accepted the length of the title. The Significance of Fellowship with God. Throughout this last week, as I was preparing to speak this morning, I wrestled with what do we share and what is appropriate. As I continued to pray, there was different, I would say, fragmented thoughts that felt like we could talk about them, but nothing came together fully. And yet it kept centering around this idea of fellowshipping with God or connecting with God or worship. And so this morning we've already heard some on the thought of worship. That very much rings true with where my heart is this morning. And so I think we have a bit of a theme going. We will talk of worship and of seeking the Lord. And when I think back to last weekend, we had a tremendous weekend of encouragement and challenge, exhortation. It was a weekend of growth in the messages that Brother Ronald had for us. I imagine that if I would ask many of you would say that it was a weekend of we might say, a spiritual boost. There was something that came out of that was meaningful. But here's a question. How do we make sure that it's more than just what we might sometimes call a quick shot in the arm or just a little boost that's going to last a little while and then it's gone? How do we make sure that it goes beyond that? Maybe for some of us, we stepped back into a busy week and the week was full and we sort of quickly forgot, or it quickly kind of waned from our mind the things that we had heard. Maybe for some of us, when we realized that the province was doing things again that we would have preferred not seeing, maybe we lost some of that. And so as I consider that, how do I make sure that we walk in joy and in victory? How do I make sure that I do that? How do you make sure that you do that? As we move through whatever things that we face on an individual level, whatever we face together, I want you to think about a thought. What does it mean for you as an individual to have fellowship with the God of the universe? What does that mean? To contemplate that you as a person, as a created being, would have fellowship with the Creator. Not just be aware of Him, not just think that He is some great creator that did something incredible, but to consider that you, as a person, have a relationship with this Creator. What does that change for you when we think about that? What's significant about that? Because there's something significant about that. When I have fellowship with the Creator of the universe, there's something significant about that. And I think that is in part the answer to why something might be short-lived sometimes when we receive spiritual encouragement, because we fail to walk fully in that fellowship. Now, if we truly have fellowship with the God of the universe, then the circumstances of life don't so easily throw us around. The busyness of life doesn't crowd out your relationship with God when you fellowship with the Creator of the universe. And so how are we doing on that? Are we fellowshipping? So what is that? What does it mean to fellowship with God? We will obviously not answer that question entirely this morning, but I want to look at a few things and see what we learn, see what we can understand. To begin, I believe that every believer has fellowship with God. So this is not a message of do you or don't you. You do. Nor is this a message that where my intention is primarily to challenge us. That's not my intention. My intention is primarily to encourage us. Maybe you will be challenged, and that is fine, but that's not really my heart this morning. My heart is that we would go home encouraged. We would go home strengthened. And so you have fellowship with God. And yet, what does that mean? How do I grow in that? Because that's what we want. So we're going to consider David today. Edward already told us we should look at the Psalms, so we'll follow his advice and look at some of the Psalms. We want to consider David and how he dealt with things. Scripture calls David a man after the heart of God. What did he do to earn that title? And I don't know that Scripture, in my quick search, I don't know that it tells us exactly in just a few words what all of that was. We find this little description in the book of Acts, obviously looking back to David. Acts chapter 13, verse 22, it says this, "And when he had removed him, he raised up unto them David to be their king." So talking about removing Saul. "To whom also he gave testimony and said, I have found David the son of Jesse, a man after mine own heart, which shall fulfill all my will." So there we get a bit of a description for why David is called a man after the heart of God, because he'll fulfill the will of God. But I think in short, when we consider who David was and we consider how he lived, and we consider the Psalms, of which he wrote many, David walked with God. David walked with God. He fellowshiped with God. We're going to use that word this morning. He fellowshiped with God. Do you and I understand what it means to fellowship with God? I'm going to look at 3 different types of fellowship, and again, this is just what I came up with. We could obviously put different labels on this, and we could make the list longer. But turn to 1 Samuel chapter 21. I have verses up as well this morning. We'll see how we do for time. 1 Samuel chapter 21, we're going to begin reading in verse 10. 3 different types of fellowship. The first type I'm going to call experience-based fellowship. We'll define that as we go along here. We're going to look at a couple of different episodes in David's life. And what did he do? This first episode is where David is running. He's fleeing from Saul. Where does he go? He goes to Achish, to the land of Gath, which happens to be the place that Goliath was from as well. We'll get there a little bit later. But he runs there because Saul is pursuing him. We'll pick up the story in verse 10. "And David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David, the king of the land? Did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? And David laid up these words in his heart, and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath." I imagine he was desperate to go there in the first place. He certainly knew where he was going. So he was afraid. He was running for his life. He said, maybe I'll find refuge here. I don't know if he thought that they would know him or how he calculated that this was the right place to go. But here he goes to Achish, and they recognize him, and they realize this is the man that has slaughtered many. This is our chance to get even, to get rid of him. And this is what David does in verse 13. It's an interesting story. It's a fascinating story. How he changed his behavior and acted like a madman, like a crazy man. Really is what he did. And he changed his behavior before them and feigned himself mad in their hands and scrambled on the doors of the gate and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Just have a mental image of what that will have looked like. David, clawing like a madman, spittle dripping down his beard. Must have been a moment of desperation to do that. Then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, you see the man is mad. Wherefore then have ye brought him to me? Have I need of a madman? Have I need of madmen, that ye have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house? And so David escapes. We know that's what happens. Now, Edward already read Psalm 34. We will go back there again, and we'll read a few of those verses again. We might not do all of them. But Psalm 34 is the psalm that David writes in response to this, the best that we know. Psalm 34 is what he writes in reflection of this experience. So this tells you a little bit about how he felt when that had happened. Psalm 34, I will bless the Lord at all times. His praise shall continually be in my mouth. My soul shall make her boast in the Lord. The humble shall hear thereof and be glad. O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. And then verse 4, he begins to be more specific, and he says, I sought the Lord, and he heard me, and delivered me from all my fears. They looked unto him and were lightened, and their faces were not ashamed. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard, and saved him out of all his troubles. And he goes on, the angel of the Lord, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. We would jump down to verse 17. The righteous cry, and the Lord heareth, and delivereth them out of all his troubles. The Lord is nigh unto them that are of broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth them out of them all. These are David's thoughts after he has played the madman and thought that he might die. Experience-based fellowship. What do I mean with that? We go through things in life where it is easy to see God at work. We look back and we see how God rescued us, or how he protected us, or how he was faithful. Sometimes in the moment we hardly recognize it, but then later on we realize God was in that moment. And he was there. And we marvel, maybe we almost cry when we think back. And we realize that in the moment, God was there. Maybe we were in an accident and we could have so easily been killed, and we see how God was in the moment. Or maybe evil was on the doorstep, and in hindsight we see God was there in that moment. This type of relationship with God may well be the most precious that we experience, in those moments when God is there in very, very real ways. And you connect with God in a very meaningful way in that moment. And you worship God. Now this is precious. And we thank God for these moments. But this type of fellowship is something that it comes and then it goes, and then it comes and it goes, and it's beyond our control. All of a sudden, this dramatic event happens and God is there. And we see his goodness. It's one type of way in which we connect with God. And it is beautiful. A second way in which we connect, I call that faith-based fellowship this morning, back to 1 Samuel. We're going to be back and forth between 1 Samuel and the Psalms. Now this is the very, very familiar story. David and Goliath. I will therefore skip much of it because we don't need to reread it all for the sake of this morning's story. Faith-based fellowship. What does it mean to have this kind of fellowship? Let's pick up the story in verse 26 for now of 1 Samuel 17. And David spake to the men that stood by him. So this is already where David has come, and he's at the battlefield. And Goliath has struck fear into everybody's heart. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And then they tell him what will be done, jumping down to verse 29. And David said, What have I now done? His brother has reprimanded him for showing up. Is there not a cause? And so we know this story. David he's rising to the challenge, and he's seeing that something needs to be done with this uncircumcised Philistine. And he turned from him toward another, and spake after the same manner, and the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul. And he sent for him. And David said to Saul, Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. I'm going to jump down to verse 40. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. David was a young man. We don't know exactly how old he was, but he was quite young. In this moment, what do you think David felt as far as a relationship went with God? Let's think about that a little bit. Picking up in verse 40, this is where the actual battle happens. And he took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had even in a scrip. And a sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. The battle's about to happen. And the Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him. For he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee what? In the name of the God, in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou, by the way, hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and I will take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the hosts of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that what? There is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with what? With sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And it came to pass, when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, then David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took thence a stone and slang it and smote the Philistine in the forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him, but there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. It's probably one of the most well-known Bible stories. An incredible story of a young man fighting the enemy. But what do we see in this story? We see a young man that was willing to rise to meet the moment. He was willing to rise and meet the challenge that needed to be met. He had a recognition of who would win this battle. He came with a sling and with a stone, and he said, The battle will not be won with a sword. God is going to win this battle. In this moment, David exercised a lot of faith. Turn to Psalm 8. To the best that I could find, this psalm is the one that he would have written as he thought of this battle. Psalm 8. These are his thoughts after this battle. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth. Who has set thy glories above the heavens? And I love verse 2. Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger. David understood that he was a young man, and he shouldn't have been the one to fight this battle. There was others that should have gone and done it. But God ordained strength out of a young person, is basically what he's saying. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him? What is man? Why do you even care, God? And the Son of Man that thou visitest him, for thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands, and thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, and the fish of the sea, and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the sea. O Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth. That is what David is thinking as he reflects on this battle. How great is your name in all the earth. You know, when we face battles that are greater than ourselves, then we're not necessarily filled with those warm feelings of how good God is, like we are when we've just been spared from some tragic accident. Much rather, if I'm facing something that I have no idea how I will face it, but I know that I need to face it, there's a certain level of uncertainty that is within my soul, and I tremble, and my flesh is trembling. And yet, at those moments, if you are willing to step out in faith and take a step and say, no, we will advance, we will move forward, we will go by faith, even though the path is very unclear, whether that's in your own personal life, in a family situation, with finances, with the world and the situation we find ourselves in, all of those things. What happens? All of a sudden, you enter into a fellowship with God that is very, very meaningful. It's not that warm, cozy type of fellowship. It's a different kind. But you're in the center of God's will, and you know He is with you. And as you charge towards Goliath, you have the audacity to be confident that God will prevail, even when we don't know exactly how. But He will prevail. He will prevail. As faith-based fellowship, this may well be the most impactful type of fellowship. This is the type of thing that if your sons and your daughters will see you commune with God like this, they will want to follow. They will want to serve that same God. Because it's the God that does the impossible. And the battles are won. So does your fellowship with God cause you to step out in faith into that which is unknown? Maybe you need to speak. Maybe you need to speak up for something. Maybe you need to stand for truth. Maybe there's a relationship that's broken, and by faith you need to go and mend that. Maybe there's someone that is lost, and you need to step in there and be, in a practical sense, the hands and feet of Jesus, and you don't know how. But as you will engage with the enemy, God will give you the ability. Because the enemy has defied the God that we serve. As you do that, you will experience a fellowship with God. And all of a sudden, that quick spiritual encouragement that you had is long-lasting. Because you're fellowshipping with God in a meaningful way. The last kind that we're going to talk about this morning is commitment-based fellowship. Again, these are just my own simple ways of trying to describe something. This is likely the most common type of fellowship that we have. 1 Samuel 22, this story chronologically would come right after the story where David was the madman. We finished reading in 1 Samuel 21, verse 15 barely. Now we're picking up in 1 Samuel 22, verse 1. David therefore departed thence, leaving Achish, and escaped to the cave Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. Sounds like a nice group of people, right? And there were with him about 400 men. And David went thence to Mizpah of Moab, and he said unto the king of Moab, Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you till I know what God will do for me. Some very interesting things there. I had not taken note of this before. But obviously Saul is still in pursuit of David. Saul is hunting David. He's become a hunted criminal. It's interesting. But David's own parents by now have joined him. Why do you think that is? I imagine it's not explicitly stated, at least not in this passage, but I imagine the fact that there was enmity between Saul and David had by now spilled into David's family, and David's own parents were no longer safe. And so they were now coming to David. So what is David doing? He's going to the king of Moab, which I imagine to be an enemy king, and he's asking the king of Moab, will you take care of my parents till I know what God will do for me? What will that have been like for David? How will that have felt? To have to go and ask the king of Moab to take care of mom and dad because the king of Israel, who should be protecting us, hates me. He also happens to be my father-in-law, and he hates me. So now I'm going to ask the king of Moab to take care of my mom and dad. That's what David does here. Verse 4, and he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. And the prophet Gad said unto David, Abide not in the hold, depart and get thee into the land of Judah. Then David departed and came into the forest of Hereth. David departs to the land of Judah. He ends up in the wilderness. That's where he goes. It's in this wilderness that, again, the best that I could find, David pens Psalm 63. So turn to Psalm 63. So he's arranged a place for his parents. He's still fleeing. Now he's in the wilderness. And this is what he says in the wilderness. Let me ask you if this reflects what you typically say when you are in the wilderness. This is what David says. O God, thou art my God. Early will I seek thee. My soul thirsteth for thee, my flesh longeth for thee in a dry and thirsty land where no water is. He's describing his situation. It's a terrible place. And yet I long for you, God. I long for you. To see thy power and thy glory, so as I have seen thee in the sanctuary. Because thy loving kindness is better than life, my lips shall praise thee. In the midst of the wilderness, are you praising? Are you worshiping? Thus will I bless thee while I live. I will lift up my hands in thy name. And remember, he's in the wilderness. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness. My mouth shall praise thee with joyful lips. When I remember thee upon my bed and meditate on thee in the night watches. He probably wasn't lying in a comfortable bed in some 5-bedroom house somewhere. He's in the wilderness. And he's thinking these thoughts. Because thou hast been my help, Therefore, in the shadow of thy wings will I rejoice. Are you rejoicing in the wilderness? My soul followeth hard after thee. Thy right hand upholdeth me. But those that seek my soul to destroy it shall go into the lower part of the earth. They shall fall by the sword. They shall be a portion for foxes. But the king shall rejoice in God. Everyone that sweareth by him shall glory. But the mouth of them that speak lies shall be stopped. In David's wilderness, he is worshiping God. He turns his eyes away from himself and largely from his problems, and he turns to the God of heaven. And he worships. Sometimes, so David, we say he was in the wilderness here. Sometimes we are in a wilderness, and we need to learn to worship in the wilderness. Sometimes we're just in the ordinary of life, and we wouldn't describe it as a wilderness, but it's just the ordinary. And in the ordinary, are you worshiping? Am I worshiping? Am I fellowshipping with God? In the ordinary, day to day, am I fellowshipping with God? Am I connecting with the God of the universe? A commitment-based fellowship that regardless of where I find myself, I am committed to worship. I am committed to fellowship with God. This is easily the least enjoyable type of fellowship, but it's probably the one that we most understand the need for. That we need to do that. We must remain committed in our fellowship with God. So as we begin to close, I want us to answer the following question. Is or has my fellowship with God been disturbed? If so, why? When was the last time that I experienced the goodness of God in a tangible way? Did I rejoice when it happened? Did I worship? Did I take time to reflect that God, in this moment, intervened in my life? When's the last time that we took a step of faith out into the battlefield and we said, God, now it's up to you, and you experienced his nearness in that place? In the ordinary of your life, are you committed to worship and fellowship? We're not talking about spending 20 minutes a day reading the Bible and 20 minutes a day praying. I'm asking, are you committed to worshiping God in the midst of the ordinary? And fellowshipping with the Creator of the universe. We are already a little bit past 12, but in a couple moments I'm going to ask Dennis to come forward, and I've selected 2 songs that I want us to sing this afternoon of worship. You know, we're stepping into a bit of an unknown again as a church. Next Sunday morning we will have 2 services, and we can easily fixate on that and either feel frustrated, feel angry, feel fearful, feel concerned, all of which are legitimate feelings. But the answer for us is to turn away and to worship the God of the universe and to fellowship with him. To fellowship with the God of the universe. He will fight for us in your individual life, for us as a church. We don't know what the future looks like. We don't know what he will yet ask us to do and what stands we will yet need to take. But we will worship. And as we worship, we too will forget about the things that are not so pleasant. So Dennis, if you want to come forward, you will lead in a couple of songs, and then You can just let's stand. You can stay standing when Dennis is done, and Edward will come forward and he will lead us in a closing prayer.
Number 81. Know me, God of my strength, enthroned above, the source of life, the fount of love. Oh, let devotion, sacred flame, our souls awake to praise thy name. God of our strength, we wait on thee, our sure defense forever be. To thee we lift our joyful eyes, to thee on wings of faith we rise. Come thou and let thy courts on earth ring out thy praise in days of mirth. God of our strength, we wait on thee, our sure defense forever be. God of our strength, from day to day, direct our thoughts and guide our way. Oh, may our hearts united be in sweet communion, Lord, with thee. God of our strength, we wait on thee, our sure defense forever be. God of our strength, on thee we call. God of our hope, our light, our all. Thy name we praise, thy love adore. Our rock, our shield forevermore. God of our strength, we wait on thee, our sure defense forever be. And number 102. Number 102. The song. Hallelujah.